For several months, a lot of you have been hearing about Markelle Fultz, the point guard from Washington, and how he's the clear-cut best player in this draft. And we also know by now, based off of the trade that's officially been announced, the Sixers are trading up from 3 to number 1, where Boston is, to be able to get the right to select Markelle Fultz and add him to their young core and hoping that he can become a real needle mover, a real franchise changer for the 76ers. Because after all, you got a hashtag trust the process, give me a break. But anyways, so there's been so much talk about Markelle Fultz, and now we get to the point of really trying to determine, because we know he's going to be the number 1 overall pick, is he going to be the best player out of this draft? Is he a future superstar? Is he worth the hype? Or is he overhyped? And I don't know if there's an easy, clear-cut answer to this, because on the one hand, when you look at the positives, I can see why people get caught up with him. You're talking about a kid that if you believe that he can play point guard at the next level, you're talking about a kid that's 6'4" with a 6'9", almost 6'10" wingspan. So he's got good height for the position, really good length for the position. He's an outstanding three-point shooter. He really, truly is, especially with the volume with which he handled the ball at Washington, the amount that he had to create his own offense, because frankly, he didn't have a ton of help around him. He was relatively proficient as a high volume three-point shooter. He's really good off of the pick and roll, so he fits very well into the modern NBA game, especially with his ability to stretch the floor and shoot the three. He has the ability to make difficult shots. You know, some guys can and some guys can't. So there's one thing that you could say, even if Markelle Fultz is defended really, really well, he kind of has a knack, a nose for being able to get his shot off, which is always one of those major sticking points when trying to project a guy to the NBA level, as whether he's going to even stick or if he's just a role player off the bench or if he could be a starter, a star, a superstar, is can they get their own shot off? And you have some really good players that really struggle to get their own shot off. One way or another, Markelle Fultz will be able to get his shot off. I think he's an adequate rebounder, especially for a point guard position, if you think he can play point guard at the NBA level. He's got pretty good floor vision. I think he's an adequate to decent passer, even though at times he didn't pass a ton at Washington because the talent around him, frankly, again, wasn't very good. I love the way he's able to control his body, kind of James Harden-like in terms of the way he can manipulate himself and find a little bit of a crease and create space that isn't there, again, to be able to get it off his own shot. So when you look at that, a kid with that size, especially if you're rejecting him as a point guard, in today's NBA, with his ability out of the pick and roll, his ability to hit the three, his ability to make difficult shots, get his own shot off consistently, I can see why people are giggly tits about him. But man, when I watch Markelle Fultz, I just don't get that LeBron James, Kevin Durant, frankly, even going back to his college days, Carmelo Anthony type of vibe, the Anthony Davis, John Wall type, Karl Anthony Towns type of vibe off of this guy. I just don't. And I think part of the reason is, granted, we're talking about a kid that played 1 year in college. So much of this is a crapshoot. And it's to be expected that the kid at 19 years of age is still going to have a lot of holes and a lot of flaws in his game. And that's understandable. And that in and of itself shouldn't be a reason to hate on the kid as a prospect, because he's only had a certain amount of time to really hone his game and apply his craft and become better. So once he gets into the professional way of life, having more time to actually dedicate solely to his game and not being focused on other things, you would expect some of those areas of deficiency to be addressed, improved, and potentially be turned into strengths. But my God, for a guy that so many people have been so high on as a clear-cut number 1 can't-miss player, he sure has a lot of question marks. Like, number 1 for me is the fact that he's a great shooter in theory, but he shoots about 64-65% from the free throw line. You can't have your franchise player with the ball in his hand so much that you can't even trust to hit 70% of his free throws. Not saying he can't get better, but that really has to be a concern to you, is that it doesn't do him a whole lot of good to get to the free throw line if there are going to be times where he's only going to hit 1 out of 2, and at times he might miss both of them. That's a real concern. That is a legitimate concern for the type of player that he is and the type of skill set that he is. How can you shoot over 40% from 3, but you can't hit over 65% from the free throw line? You have questions about his defense, his willingness, his desire to play on that side of the ball, his abilities on that side of the ball. Now, I think there are definitely traits that you can work with from a physical aspect. I think he could be a solid defender because I think he has a decent head for the game, but it is obviously a question. But again, for a lot of 19-year-olds, it is a question, period. Not a lot of kids are great defenders at 19 years of age, especially NBA level defense, even though you wonder what NBA level defense is even anymore, especially if we're watching this year's NBA Finals. But you have some concerns about consistency of effort. And at times it seemed like he was too willing to go with the flow. He lacked that kind of dog in him to be able to show that killer instinct and desire to take over the game and impose his will upon it too many times, especially against elite level competition. And to me, that's a real concern too, is that sometimes against elite level competition, he didn't really step his game up. He just kind of was content to kind of go with the flow and just kind of let things play out and try to fit in accordingly. When you're supposed to be the top dog, you can't do that. You have to lead the way. And if your team doesn't foul, they don't foul. So I worry about, as a point guard potentially at the NBA level, does he have the type of floor leadership, floor general type of ability that he's going to be able to put a team on his back? Then you have to look at the lack of team success. And I'm not saying he had to lead his team to the Sweet 16 or the Final Four or anything, but Christ's sakes, I don't even think they won 10 games. I mean, golly. Like even Ben Simmons at LSU last year, at least his team won more than 10 games. I mean, you could talk about the lack of talent around him, and it's true, he didn't have a lot of talent around him. You could talk about the fact that Lorenzo Romar was no longer suited to be the head coach at Washington, and that is also true. But for crying out loud, this team didn't even win 10 games. And it really makes you wonder, is he really a great player, or did he just put up great numbers because he was in a garbage type of situation with a lot of garbage time where he could dominate the ball, shoot a lot, therefore score a lot, and his numbers were artificially propped up? And would other college players of decent talent in that type of situation put up just as good, if not better, overall numbers? I think it is a fair question to ask. I don't think that lack of team success should automatically preclude him from being viewed as a potential star or superstar at the NBA level. But again, we're talking about question marks, potential weaknesses. It is a concern. It is a question mark. But my number one concern for him is a lack of explosiveness. He's not a very explosive guy. I don't care what anybody says. Now, that doesn't mean that he can't play or potentially dominate at the NBA level, because James Harden, I don't think anybody refers to as a really explosive type of player, and he's been able to figure it out. He does it off of guile and drawing offensive fouls or making contact all the time and playing through the offensive fouls that should be called on him, but of course aren't because he is a superstar now. But that lack of explosiveness is really concerning, and it's more concerning to me because can he really stick at the point guard position and defend the point guard position at the NBA level? Because I think part of the value of Markelle Fultz is looking at him as his potential as a scorer at the NBA level at 6'4" at that size at the point guard position. If he ends up not being able to stick at point guard and you got to play him at the 2, then he's more D'Angelo Russell than he is a James Harden. And that significantly changes how you view him in the grand scheme of things. And again, when we're talking about a guy and wanting him to be a generational type of franchise-changing, needle-moving type of player, I'd like him to be at least somewhat explosive. And he just really isn't. It doesn't mean he can't stick at the NBA level. It doesn't mean he can't play or play well and play at a decent to high level consistently. But he's going to have to figure out other ways to do it because he's not going to be able to do it some nights just based off of athleticism alone. And sometimes it's nice to just be able to do it off of athleticism alone. So when you look at him, there's such a wide range of comparisons in terms of the type of player he could be. His upside is probably James Harden. There are elements there similar to Harden at Arizona State where you say, hey, he could be that type of guy. He could maybe be a slightly lesser version of as a guard, but still be a really good player like a CJ McCollum, a guy who could score a bunch but doesn't really do a whole lot else, especially as a 2 guard. He could be D'Angelo Russell, a guy with a lot of hype coming out of college with what was viewed to be decent size as a point guard, but he really can't play the point guard position at the NBA level, and nor is it his best positional fit. Or he's a guy that, with his lack of explosiveness, could gain some weight, could have some injury troubles, and then really have it negatively impact the type of player that he becomes in the NBA and be somebody like an Eric Gordon. I mean, the range of who he could be is sweeping. He could be Harden, he could be McCollum, he could be Russell, he could be Eric Gordon. It's a high ceiling and a kind of middling floor. So to me, it's really hard to see why he's such a clear-cut number 1 player, can't miss guy in this draft. To me, it is. And I don't know why a team like the 76ers would be so giggly tits to move up from 3-1 to get him, when to me, I just don't see where there's enough of a difference, enough of a valley or a gulf between him and everybody else to justify giving up what you have to give up to go up and get him. Now, granted, if you like the dude and you think he's that dude, then you go up and get him and you ask for forgiveness later. I applaud that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is the right decision. Furthermore, for all these Philly fans using this as an excuse to talk shit and try to validate, the process and talking about trust the process and retweet Armageddon, again, I ask you, why are you talking shit about a team that hasn't won shit? You're now into year 5 of the process. When are you going to start to have this pay off? And when we're talking about trading up for Markelle Fultz, there's no guarantee of anything. And an awful lot of questions for a guy that you're hoping can be a real cornerstone for your team and a potential franchise player. And was he just a guy that took advantage of a situation on a bad team where he put up garbage numbers and really didn't have to play with a lot of pressure on him because it didn't matter because his team wasn't going to win anyways? What's going to happen when he gets to the pressure cooker of playing in Philly? Because at some point in time, the Philly fans are eventually going to expect some payoff to having guys like Embiid, Simmons, and Fultz, other than the payoff of actually seeing all 3 of these guys play together on the goddamn floor. I mean, at some point in time, you have to wonder. Now, with that said, I think the fit in the situation for Fultz in Philly is pretty good. I think you could look at him as being a guy that could be a secondary scorer to Embiid, a secondary ball handler to complement Simmons, a guy that gives this team some three-point shooting that they desperately, desperately need. So I think the fit is good. I actually think the fit is really good. And I think in terms of seeing Markelle Fultz reach his full potential, I think Philadelphia might have actually been a better overall fit than Boston was. Especially if Philly is insistent upon playing Ben Simmons as their primary ball handler and playing him at the point guard position. Now you've got Markelle Fultz playing the 2, which is where the fuck he's got to play, I think, long term at the NBA. But again, there's an awful lot of concerns to sit there and call this guy can't miss. So frankly, I do think he's a little overhyped. I think he has star potential, but I'm sorry, I just don't see it at this point. Doesn't mean that it can't develop. Doesn't mean that it can't develop. Because coming out of Arizona State, there was thought that maybe Harden could be a star, but being a superstar franchise player MVP type of guy, absolutely not. Steph Curry, what more do I need to say? Sometimes these guys come in and they develop, they figure it out, and they become superstars. I just think there are so many concerns about Fultz that I lean more closely to him being a little bit of a disappointment at the NBA level in terms of the high expectations and what people project him to be and pretend him to be, then the reality is going to be him actually being a superstar. I think he's a good player. I don't think he's going to bust. But I think clear-cut number 1 player, future many-time all-star, being a real needle mover for the Philadelphia Sixers organization, I think we need to pump the brakes on that talk just a little bit. Because frankly, again, I think if you watch his game, there are things to really like about him, as I addressed. But there are an awful lot of concerns. And yes, 19 years old, plenty of time to change him. But he's got a lot to work on. And that is a little too much to work on for my liking to be able to say that this guy will be a superstar and a franchise player for the Philadelphia 76ers. So for me, you can come back in 2 or 3 years and shit on me and if I want when I'm wrong. But in the meantime, I think he's just a little too overhyped for my liking.